a highly decorated Army colonel, the remains of a fallen soldier, and a flight he was unexpectedly barred from. What followed sent shockwaves across the nation. The airport buzzed with activity. Families tugged rolling suitcases. Business travelers remained absorbed in their phones, and children dashed ahead of weary parents. Just the usual commotion. Colonel David Carter stepped inside, his polished dress shoes tapping against the tile floor. He had navigated this process countless times, but today was different. The weight pressing on his chest wasn't just from the ribbons and medals adorning his uniform. It was from the casket resting on the tarmac, draped in the American flag. Private First Class Jason Reynolds, only 21 years old, taken too soon. Colonel Carter adjusted his hat and drew in a steady breath. He had a duty to fulfill, one that surpassed rank or personal recognition. This wasn't about him. It was about honoring the promise made to every soldier who never returned home. No one gets left behind. Approaching the airline counter, he placed his military orders and ID on the desk. At first, the woman behind the counter barely acknowledged him, typing away on her keyboard. Then, her brow furrowed as she glanced at the screen. A brief hesitation. She looked up, her pause lasting just a fraction too long. "Sir, may I see that again?" Her voice was taut. Carter handed the documents over once more, watching her closely. A flicker of hesitation, a sideways glance at her colleague, a subtle shift in her stance, as if she had just stepped into an unexpected situation. She turned and whispered something to another agent. The man she consulted glanced over, his expression unreadable. The air thickened with an unspoken tension. When she returned, her smile was stiff, forced. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We can't allow you to board at this time." Carter exhaled slowly. He had dealt with all kinds of difficult situations: combat zones, diplomatic negotiations, political red tape. But this was something else entirely. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he said evenly, tapping the paperwork. "Everything is in order." The agent avoided his gaze. "I understand, sir, but due to security protocols, we're unable to make an exception." Carter kept his voice composed. "Security protocol?" "Yes, sir," she said, forcing another uneasy smile. "It's just company policy." He remained still, unwavering. "Policy? What policy?" Behind him, the line was growing. People shifted, murmured. He could feel their eyes on him, but instead of stepping aside, he squared his shoulders. He wasn't going anywhere without an explanation. The airline staff, however, showed no signs of relenting. The atmosphere at the counter grew heavier. Conversations behind him began to hush as more passengers took notice. A uniformed officer being denied a flight wasn't something you saw every day. Colonel Carter remained composed. "Ma'am, I need to understand exactly what the issue is. This is a military assignment, not a personal trip. My documentation is valid." The agent hesitated once more, her eyes darting toward a group of airline employees, whispering in the background. Finally, a supervisor, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, stepped forward. Adjusting his name tag, he crossed his arms and regarded Carter. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he began, his tone carefully measured, the kind people used when they wanted you to stop asking questions. "But we have certain policies in place, and unfortunately, we're unable to override them at this time." There it was again. Policies. Carter inhaled deeply through his nose. He had seen this before, just in a different context. "I've traveled with military escorts before," he said, keeping his frustration controlled under years of discipline. "I know the procedures, and I know there's no policy preventing me from boarding. So let's be honest. What's the real reason I'm being denied? The supervisor cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. It's just an extra security measure. Nothing personal, sir. Nothing personal. That was a stretch. Carter clenched his jaw, but refused to let anger take over. He had been in too many rooms where vague explanations like this were used as shields. They were testing his patience, waiting for him to lose his temper, to give them an excuse to call security. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Passengers in line were now paying attention. A woman in a red blazer murmured something to her husband. A young man clutching his boarding pass frowned, glancing between Carter and the airline employees, trying to make sense of the situation. Then, a voice cut through the thick silence. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Carter turned slightly. A man a few spots behind him had spoken. Older, perhaps in his mid-60s, with a weathered face and a USMC cap pulled low over his brow. A Marine. A veteran. The supervisor looked uneasy. "No, sir, this isn't about clearance," he said quickly. "We're just following standard protocol." The Marine let out a sharp breath. "Yeah, I've been through airport security 1,000 times, and I've never seen protocol stop a soldier from bringing one of our own home." He crossed his arms. "So what's really going on?" A murmur spread through the line. Passengers exchanged glances, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was undeniable. The airline staff behind the counter felt it too. The agent who had initially denied Carter a seat darted a nervous glance at her supervisor, looking unsure. The supervisor sighed, rubbing his temple. He looked at Carter, the weight of the situation settling on him. "Let me check something," he muttered before stepping away. The agent at the counter suddenly found her computer screen very interesting, avoiding eye contact. Carter stood his ground, shoulders squared, gaze steady. He wasn't moving, and neither was this story. The murmur in the terminal was no longer just background noise. It was focused, charged. People weren't just waiting for their flights anymore. They were watching, recording. The Marine who had spoken earlier wasn't the only one growing agitated. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket clutched her purse and shook her head, whispering to her husband, "This isn't right. He's in uniform." Nearby, a younger man in a hoodie had his phone out, fingers flying across the screen. More people were taking notice, and that spelled trouble for the airline. Carter kept his expression unreadable, but he was cataloging every detail. The supervisor hadn't returned yet, which meant one of two things. Either he was scrambling for an excuse or waiting for the situation to die down. Neither was going to happen. Then, a voice from behind him. "Excuse me, sir?" Carter turned slightly. A young woman, no older than 25, stood a few feet away, phone in hand, her expression uncertain, but resolute. I don't mean to intrude, but I just want to make sure I understand. They're not letting you board?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It was careful, deliberate, enough to draw even more attention. Carter exhaled, glancing at the agent behind the counter. "That's correct." The woman blinked, as if expecting a different response. After a brief pause, she nodded and turned her phone screen toward him. "I'm live right now," she said. "People need to see this." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Another man held up his phone. "This is wrong," he said, shaking his head. "This man is literally escorting a fallen soldier." Further back, a woman raised her voice. "Hey, excuse me," she called toward the counter, waving her hand. "Can someone explain why he's being denied?" Some passengers hesitated, unsure whether to get involved. But the energy in the room had shifted. What had started as quiet whispers was now something bigger, something the airline could no longer ignore. The agent behind the counter looked like she wanted to disappear. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen, her eyes flickering between the phones pointed in her direction. Then, the Marine from earlier stepped forward. He was done playing nice. "I've seen a lot in my time," he said, voice calm but firm. "But I never thought I'd witness an American soldier, especially one escorting a fallen comrade, being treated this way." The terminal fell eerily silent. Even the usual overhead announcements seemed distant, muted. The only sound was the soft beeping of recording devices capturing every second. The Marine squared his shoulders. "This is a disgrace." The agent swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled as she resumed typing, but the supervisor was still nowhere to be seen. Passengers whispered among themselves. A baby fussed in a stroller, but instead of soothing her child, the mother was fixated on her phone, her expression darkening as she read something. Then, from the back of the line, someone muttered, "It's already trending." Carter didn't move. He didn't need to. The world was watching now. The tension thickened. The supervisor was still absent. The airline staff stood frozen in awkward silence. Phones were out, recording, tweeting, streaming. And then, like a single spark igniting dry grass, it spread. The young man in the hoodie, still glued to his phone, let out a low whistle. "Damn, this is everywhere now." Carter didn't react. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. But from the way the agent stiffened, he could tell she knew it too. The woman in the denim jacket checked her phone and gasped. "Oh my God," she whispered to her husband. "It's already on Facebook." The older Marine grunted, pulling out his own phone. They have no idea what kind of storm they just started. Then, as if on cue, the airport loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention passengers. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 237 to Phoenix will be delayed. We apologize for any inconvenience." A few groans rippled through the crowd, but most people barely noticed. Their attention was fixed on the uniformed soldier being denied a flight while carrying out his duty. Then, a gasp came from near the windows. "He's on Twitter." A young woman turned her phone toward the crowd, and people leaned in. On her screen, a tweet in bold capital letters read, "They just denied a black U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. Let him fly." Below it, the numbers were climbing fast. Retweets, comments, likes. The story was spreading like wildfire. Then, another notification popped up. This one was from a veterans advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at airport name. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." A murmur swept through the terminal. The realization was sinking in. The airline had completely lost control of the situation. Behind the counter, the agent who had denied Carter's flight let out a shaky breath. She quickly turned and disappeared behind a frosted glass door. She wasn't coming back with an answer. She was coming back with damage control. Carter adjusted his hat. He had been in situations like this before. Not in an airport, not quite like this, but in places where powerful people suddenly realized they had made the wrong enemy. He wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating, because at the end of the day, this wasn't about him. It was about Private First Class Jason Reynolds, the young man who still needed to get home. And right now, that mission remained unfinished. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. The air in the terminal felt different now, charged, expectant. Then, at last, the supervisor returned. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was another man, dressed in a sharp navy suit, an airline ID clipped neatly to his pocket. His stride was quick, controlled, someone used to putting out fires. He stopped just short of the counter, scanning the scene. His eyes flickered between Carter, the Marine, and the sea of phones still recording. Then, he cleared his throat. "Colonel, I sincerely apologize for the miscommunication. It seems there was an error in our system, but we're working to get you on your flight as soon as possible." Miscommunication. Carter had been in the military long enough to know what that word really meant. It meant, we got caught. It meant, fix this before it costs us too much. He let the moment linger, watching as the airline representative shifted under the weight of the silence. "I see," Carter finally said, his voice calm. "An error, you said?" The man nodded. "Yes, sir. A regrettable mistake. We assure you it was not intentional." Scoffs rippled through the crowd. The Marine beside Carter shook his head. The airline rep adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "We'd like to personally escort you to the gate now, Colonel. First-class accommodations, of course." First class. As if that was the point. Carter's gaze flicked past the man, toward the counter, toward the agent who still stood there, eyes downcast. The same agent who had stiffly smiled while denying him. The same agent who hadn't even checked before saying no. Carter exhaled slowly. "I appreciate the urgency," he said, "but I need to clarify something." The rep nodded quickly. "Of course." Carter's voice remained steady. "If no one recorded this, if no one spoke up, would I still be standing here?" A heavy silence. The rep swallowed. "Sir, You don't need to answer," Carter interrupted. He already knew. Everyone in the terminal knew. A murmur spread through the crowd. Then, a woman near the front whispered, "He's right." The rep straightened, trying to regain control. "Again, sir, we sincerely apologize." Carter shook his head. "We both know this isn't about an apology. It's about accountability." People nodded in agreement. The anger had shifted. This wasn't just outrage anymore. It was disappointment. The rep's posture stiffened. He tried again. "Colonel, let's get you on your flight now." But before Carter could respond, another voice cut in. "Sir." A young airport security officer had stepped up beside the counter, holding out a phone. His expression was tight. "I think you should see this." The rep frowned, taking the phone. He scrolled, and his face went pale. The Marine crossed his arms. "What? Something wrong?" The rep didn't answer. He didn't need to. Carter already knew. The backlash had officially exploded. A major news outlet had picked up the story. The headline was blunt. U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers. Below it, a video clip played, footage straight from the terminal. The rep inhaled sharply, handed the phone back, and turned to Carter. His voice was thinner now, forced. "We deeply regret this situation." Carter said nothing. "We'd like to issue a public statement clarifying." Carter cut him off. "The public already knows the truth." Silence. The airline representative pressed his lips together, clearly out of options. Carter took a slow look around. The crowd, the phones still recording. Then, he turned back to the rep. "I don't need first class. I don't need special treatment. I need respect. And so does the soldier I'm escorting." A murmur ran through the crowd again. The rep gave a stiff nod, the only response he could muster. "Understood, sir." Beside Carter, the Marine let out a small, approving grunt. Carter adjusted his hat. "Now, let's finish this mission." But for the airline, the real fallout was just beginning. The damage was already done. The story was out, spreading faster than they could contain it. The terminal no longer felt like just an airport. It had become a public stage, a press conference with an audience that wasn't going anywhere. Then, something unexpected happened. A man in a dark blue suit entered the scene, moving with the unmistakable authority of someone who outranked everyone in the room. He wasn't from the airline. He wasn't airport security. He was military. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Passengers instinctively stepped aside as he approached. His ID badge flashed briefly as he extended a hand toward Carter. "Colonel," he said firmly, "I'm Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation." Carter met his grip with equal strength. He didn't need to ask how the major had gotten there so quickly. The military doesn't hesitate when it comes to its own. Beckett turned to the airline representative, his voice crisp. "We are handling this now. Colonel Carter and the remains of Private First Class Reynolds will not be flying commercial." The rep blinked, caught off guard. Sir, we were just about to—" "You were just about to cover your tracks," Beckett cut in. His tone remained polite, but it carried undeniable weight. He glanced at Carter. "Sir, the Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. Your transport is ready." A ripple went through the crowd. People exchanged glances. The U.S. military had stepped in. Carter exhaled, not out of relief, because he hadn't needed saving, but because the mission was finally back on track. He gave a single nod. "Understood." Major Beckett turned back to the airline rep, delivering one final statement. "This will be addressed." It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Carter turned to the Marine, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet satisfaction. "Appreciate you, brother," Carter said. The Marine tipped his head. "We look out for our own." Carter took one last glance around the terminal. The people who had spoken up, who had refused to let this slide, who had ensured the truth was heard. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and walked out. Not toward the gate, toward something bigger. But for the airline, the storm was just beginning. They assumed the outrage would fade. A few apologies, a carefully worded press release, maybe a statement from the CEO. Classic damage control. But the public wasn't letting this go. News networks picked up the story. Veterans organizations released statements condemning the airline's actions. Politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. Then came the financial hit. By the end of the week, the airline's stock had dropped. A boycott gained traction online. Their social media pages were flooded with demands for answers. And then, the final blow. A lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline, citing discrimination and failure to uphold service member protections. Under immense pressure, the airline's CEO finally made a public appearance. He called it a regrettable misunderstanding, and announced that the employees involved had been placed on administrative leave. Too little, too late. Meanwhile, Colonel Carter completed his mission. He escorted Private First Class Jason Reynolds home, standing by as the young soldier's family received him one final time. Carter didn't need the headlines. He didn't need the attention. He needed respect. And that was the real fight. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't require a viral video or public outrage. It should be the standard. The people in that airport, the Marine, the passengers who spoke up, the ones who refused to stay silent, had proven something important. When people stand together, injustice has nowhere to hide. If you believe in accountability, if you believe in honoring those who serve, let your voice be heard. Because silence allows these things to happen again. And next time, it might not go viral.